Hello, everybody, and welcome back to your favorite podcast, the IBS Freedom Podcast. I'm Nikki, and I am joined by my co-host, Amy Hollicamp, RT.
Hey, everybody.
And we're here to talk about diversity. That kind of rhymed, right?
Yeah,
RD,
it actually did. That was nice. That was nicely done.
I'm giving myself credit. Thank you. And I remembered to give my own name this time, too, which is kind of a fluke for me, so that's very exciting, too. So...
Yes.
As I already said, you know the drill. I introduce and then I kick it to you for our opening words. Diversity. I think this is probably both of our favorite topic, if I had to guess. So I'm very excited for this conversation. But let me kick it to you, oh dear Amy. Let's talk about diversity. And first of all, what is it? I mean, I know people get the word diversity, but what are we specifically talking about? Are we talking about diversity in the nose, in the gut, in the skin, in the world? And we'll start to talk about why that matters, and then finally how to obtain it. So kick it off. What is diversity? Why should we care?
Yeah, I think in terms of diversity, it's what microbes are in your microbiome. I think it can be in the skin and the nose. I mean, there's diversity in each of the microbiomes, like the little communities in the nose and even in the vaginal canal. But I think, again, what we typically talk about is diversity in the gut. And that's, what type of microbes do you have? Do you have richness in your microbiome? Do you have different types of bugs that can do different things for you? I think that's the main thing I try to clue on with the clients that I work with from a diversity standpoint. It's you really want a diverse ecosystem in your microbes, because the more diverse your ecosystem is, the more that they can help you. Yeah. The more jobs they can do for you. We have evolved with these microbes through time, and they do a lot of special functions for us. And I think when you have a lot of different types of microbes that can do different things for you, it usually enhances your health. It also helps to keep pathogens away at bay if your gut is really diverse. If there's a healthy ecosystem, things aren't going to overgrow. It's similar to an ecosystem in nature. You want diversity of plants and animals to help keep the ecosystem healthy. I think of diversity in that way. You want an array of different microbes that can do different jobs for you.
You want a tropical rainforest in your gut.
Right, exactly. And I think in terms of the SIBO IBS space, unfortunately, diversity isn't really honed in on enough. It might be, or at all. I love the head shake. No. And instead of understanding that the gut's a very delicate ecosystem, the typical IBS SIBO perspective tends to be, let's zero in on one microbe or an overgrowth and kill it, kind of wage war on the system with little regard to what is being done to the diversity of the gut. And I hope that in this podcast, this particular episode, we can help people think about the gut in a little bit different way. If you're in a little bit of a rut right now, which it's easy to be in a rut when I think a lot of the functional integrative space that we've talked about before is so heavy-handed on pinpointing one microbe. Oh, you have a high level of this. We need to destroy things. And there's sometimes when a little bit of pruning makes sense, but when it's overboard and overkill, it can really start to hinder diversity. And then all the diets that are going to ruin diversity, being so restrictive in terms of fibers, because every microbe has its favorite food source. So if your diet's limited to a handful of foods, or you're eating the same meals each day, it's going to be hard to you could lose diversity. That could be hard to get back. There's still a lot of ways to build it, but I think sometimes just understanding that how delicate the gut is so important. And I'm glad we can talk about diversity today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head that certainly in the SIBO space, honestly, like, they don't give two shits about diversity in the SIBO space.
Right,
and I don't care if
right.
we're talking about conventional medical world, who's just prescribing rifaximin or Xifaxan or metronidazole all day, every day, or the conventional dietetics world, where they're probably doing like low FODMAP or SCD or some restricted ass diet, or the functional medicine space, which maybe you're getting a bit of both. You're killing shit and you're starving it.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
those are the two biggest factors that are going to contribute to low or poor diversity is antibiotic use. And yes, we can still lump in antimicrobial herbs to some degree with that. Like, oregano doesn't get a free pass just because it's a natural compound. Like, natural things can still harm you, and they can do things that we don't want them to do if you're not smart about how you use them. So there's, antimicrobials or antibiotics and dietary restriction. Those are the two things that we know really, really strongly inhibit diversity. And then you're off to the races. You've got all sorts of other problems if you don't have a diverse gut. You might have started out with a simple case of SIBO. I'm using air quotes because it's never simple. But you might have started out with a straightforward case of SIBO, and now you lose diversity, and now you have candida and leaky gut and autoimmunity and inflammation and Lord knows what else. And it's this slippery slope where then people restrict more. Like, oh, now I have an autoimmune disease. Maybe I need to do AIP. Or maybe I need to do a stricter diet. Or I need to do food sensitivity testing. And it's like, you keep going down further and further down this rabbit hole until you have a pretty shoddy looking microbiome with hardly any diversity.
Yeah. I think the frustrating aspect to me is, from what you're describing too, is, well, the two sides. So the conventional side, I feel like there's not really a deeper look at all. It's just like, oh, do you have an overgrowth? Rifaximin should take care of it. Like, oh, it came back.
Magical
oh,
fairy dust.
Take this again. So like a lot of times it's these cyclical strategies where you're just taking rifaximin every 3 months or 6 months or whatever whenever your symptoms come back, you're taking this antibiotic. And what I hear often too is, rifaximin just works in the small intestines because it's bile activated, which I think there's truth to that based on what I've researched. But like, you still want the small intestines to have some diversity to it as well. Exactly. So like, sometimes people will be like, oh, like rifaximin's this like amazing drug that's not going to affect the microbiome in the large intestines, because they're still in this mindset that they have to clear out the small intestines completely.
Yeah.
So I find
sterile.
that, right. I find that frustrating too. I hear that mindset a lot when I talk to my clients. It's like, oh, well, rifaximin's like this pass from an antibiotic standpoint. And I think it probably is better than taking an antibiotic that's going to be totally like systemic and going to wipe out everything downstream. But still, like, there's still going to be some ramifications to your diversity taking rifaximin. So
yeah, you don't get off scot-free just because you're decimating the small bowel microbiome. You don't get off scot-free because guess what? The small bowel microbiome diversity matters too.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Right.
Like, we knew, but
well, and I know that Pimentel study that came out where they analyzed the microbiome, that was like one thing they mentioned, but I feel like they didn't really talk about it in much detail, but I found to be like one of the major things that I took out of that study is the diversity is lower in people that have SIBO. Well, if you're just constantly, if the solution then is just rifaximin over and over and over again, like you're just going to keep
or oregano or whatever it might be.
Right. You're just going to keep depleting the diversity. So I just think it's such a key piece that is not focused in on, is sort of ignored. And I do think that it's just, I think it frustrates me a lot in the conventional sphere. And then like what you're saying too, the functional space, you get oftentimes people are like, oh, this is like the natural way to go, but it could almost be argued to be a little bit more damaging if you're removing all the foods.
I feel like,
go ahead.
I feel like you'd almost be better off diversity-wise with the conventional medical model in a way, because at least if you think about it, they're going to give you like 10 days of rifaximin, and then maybe they'll prescribe it again if it comes back, but they're going to give you 10 days worth of an antimicrobial. And then if they suggest that you do like the low FODMAP diet, at least sometimes you're working with a dietitian, and they're more often than not going to try to help you. I mean, you could speak to this more than me, but like at least a lot of dietitians are going to walk people through like the elimination phase of low FODMAP and then reintroducing and trying to get some foods back. So it's a little bit less dogmatic, I feel like, and it is used as more of a temporary solution, as opposed to in functional medicine or like a more integrative or naturopathic space. It's like, you have to starve the SIBO and all of these foods are forever off limits until you eradicate the SIBO. Like, you cannot look cross-eyed at an onion ever again. And it's like, it's more of like, I think that in functional medicine, there's less of a conversation of how to introduce FODMAPs and how to find your specific trigger foods. Whereas at least in the conventional dietetic space, I feel like they're having that conversation more because they're not going at it. Again, you could speak to this more than I can, but I feel like they're at least looking at it as a Band-Aid for the symptoms as opposed to trying to starve the SIBO. Is that a thing that you think that conventional RDs are thinking about a lot, like starving the SIBO with low FODMAP, or is it more of just symptom management?
I think, conventional RDs still have a strong foundation of nutrition. So they are going to be more aware of, how cutting foods affect the body, or at least that's kind of my understanding. Being an RD, like, we all value nutrition so much. I find that a lot of times when the attitude is like, starve the SIBO at all costs, like, you totally lose sight of nutrition with that person. So I feel like for me, the conventional RDs are probably going to still think a broad and diverse diet as much as possible is the goal. Versus if the primary goal is, like what you're saying, starve the SIBO, but you're not necessarily looking at nutrition and how things are going to be affected through the process of trying to starve the SIBO. That's problematic. And I think you're right. Like, I think RDs understand that it's a therapy. It's not like a long-term thing. And I that's a huge miss and a huge mismanagement of the tool of low FODMAP is giving someone a handout and saying, like, do not eat these foods. I mean, I hear some awful messaging from some of the conventional and like integrative practitioners, which is like, you will never eat FODMAPs again. Like kind of these sorts of messages that I find are so extreme and just false. And it's not how you use low FODMAP, and it freaks people out so much. I mean, if I was told by a doctor that I couldn't have FODMAPs again, like, I don't know, that'd freak me out. So I just think because there's a lack of true understanding from a nutrition side of things and a lot of the functional, integrative, and even conventional space, if they're just like a doctor practitioner and the goal is starving the SIBO, which I don't know how how that becomes a goal, but go ahead.
Finish your thought.
I think that's such a frustrating it's such a frustrating mindset to get in and to put into the client or patient's head. That's just like, oh, I need to starve the SIBO, because I want almost 100% of the time if someone starts to really hone in on that idea, it's hard to break them out of that mindset.
Oh, yes.
And then it's going to hinder diversity. Like, it's going to have all these downstream ramifications. Yeah. And I don't think the practitioners are doing this intentionally. I don't think that they're necessarily thinking about the downstream effects that this could have.
Yeah. 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 And I was going to say on one rabbit trail real quick, and then I want to get to another point, is that have you ever seen a single study saying that the low FODMAP diet or one of these SIBO diets actually, in fact, starves the SIBO and is good for the clearance of SIBO? Yeah. Like, I actually haven't seen that studied, really. There's a lot of research on using the low FODMAP diet for symptomatic improvement in IBS. And we could say, oh, a lot of the people who have IBS, in fact, have SIBO. But, like, I've never actually seen a study looking at SIBO and the low FODMAP diet specifically, and yet it's like a knee-jerk reflex. Like, everybody, it's like word association at this point. Like, oh, SIBO, low FODMAP. And it's just so, like, ingrained in SIBO culture right now that that's something you do, or you have to be on a SIBO diet, whether you're doing biphasic or SIBO, you know, the SCD low FODMAP hybrid. Like, it's almost just like this knee-jerk reflex, and I don't know who started it. Like, I don't know who started this idea that low FODMAP starves the SIBO and therefore you need to do it, but it's pervasive. Everybody believes it, aside from literally like you and me and our patients. And some of my patients are not totally on board. They're still skeptical, but we're working on it. But it's really bizarre. I feel like an alien looking in and looking around like, how did you guys come to this conclusion? Because I haven't seen research.
Right. And I think, you know, the earlier, like, SIBO is such a new thing. Like, I feel like it hasn't really been on the scene that long.
No.
I feel like some of the kind of more pioneering, like, people that were talking about SIBO early on were big into the restrictive diets. Yes. And I just think it got so pervasive that, like, oh, not to name names, but, like, this person says I have to do, like, this diet, and then they're teaching everybody because they're now kind
the
of
authority.
Right, they're the authority. And I just think that it's really time to take a step back and kind of change some things, hopefully. And I think there are some subtle things changing, but it's very frustrating because I do think, you know, it makes sense on the surface to potentially, like, starve bacteria. I think on the very kind of thin surface of, like, oh, I have an overgrowth.
Yeah.
You know, taking some of these foods out of my diet that would feed it, that's a good idea. So I do think it makes sense on the surface, but like, again, in reality, I don't see it being helpful.
Yeah.
And again, it has all these other ramifications that aren't discussed. And so I think it's very frustrating. I think you're right. There's not really any studies
if one of you finds it, put it in the YouTube comments. If you have seen a study documenting that one of these so-called SIBO diets actually starves the SIBO, pop it in the comments on YouTube. I would love to see it, or email it to us, because I have yet to see that and I've looked. But I think that, too, if you think about it, I think we joked at one point on an earlier podcast episode that SIBO is like the current golden child, or it's the current thing in the spotlight, but the predecessor before SIBO for a lot of years was Candida. Yeah. And I think that it's kind of also a remnant of that, because the Candida diet and the idea of starving Candida has been around for a really long time, like at least a decade or two or three. So I think it's like we had this framework from the world of Candida that we need to kill it, we need to starve it. And then also it kind of like translated into the SIBO sphere. But similarly, I don't know, you know, I've seen some Petri dish studies where they put glucose on a Petri dish, and Candida does seem to like glucose. And honestly, like, I kind of wonder how the Candida diet evolved and how it became a thing that's so popular. Yeah. Because honestly, I could kind of imagine that it was some practitioner or some nutritionist or whoever who was like, okay, how do I get my patients to not eat shit? Like, how do I get them to stop drinking soda and eating Pop-Tarts and eating Skittles and cheese doodles? Oh, I know. I'm going to tell them that the sugar and the carbs feed the candida. That'll get them to take action. Because honestly, some people, you could recommend a relatively easy nutritional intervention of just like, hey man, eat less sugar. Or hey, try going gluten-free for a month, which I'm sorry, in this day and age is easy to do. But like you could make very easy, relatively easy nutritional recommendations. And there are some people who will act like you're asking them to chop off their left arm, barbecue it, and then eat it. Like, it's just, and it's like, we're all on our own journey. I'm not trying to judge, but also those people make me want to rip my hair out by the roots because I'm like, I have this good advice. Why aren't you listening to me? I could help you feel better. So I don't know. Like, I even wonder, like, low FODMAP for SIBO or like low carb or low processed carbs for candida. I almost wonder if it was like some clinician somewhere was like, all right, how do I trick my patient into not eating shit? Oh, here we go. This'll do it. And then the candida diet was born. And like, I do think there's something to be said, whether you have candida or not, for not eating shit food all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't, if you have ice cream every day, or if you have wine every day, like, it's no longer a treat. It's a habit, and you're feeding something. Whether it be like emotional stuff or candida stuff, like, it's not health promoting to eat a lot of garbage anyway, but it kind of like fueled this movement of like, we have to starve it. And if you eat even a morsel of sugar or onion, you're feeding the bad thing and it will win and you will lose. And it's very like fear-mongery, scary. But, I find that some people, when I talk to them, and I spoke with somebody like this morning, she worked with a nutritionist who I'm sure, like, well-intentioned professionals, don't get me wrong, but like this nutritionist, she had some adverse reactions to a supplement or something. And the nutritionist said, hey, maybe it caused SIBO. So they did food sensitivity testing and eliminated a bunch of stuff. And then they combined that with low FODMAP. And the lady said she's down to eating 10 foods. 10.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And, she still has symptoms. She still has issues. And the nutritionist now is like, well, I can't help you anymore. You're a tough case. And now she's, and it's like, but also you're like frigging up her body royally. And I talked to her briefly today and I was like, well, do you have symptoms from eating some of these foods, or were you eliminating them just in hopes of starving the SIBO, which, by the way, we don't even know if she has SIBO. Her breath test was negative, but we're like, did you have symptoms? She's like, well, there's certain things, like she knows she has an allergy to one food, and she knows that like certain things trigger gastritis for her, but like, other things, like she said, I added in white potatoes and it was fine. Like, and I added in pears and it was fine. I'm like, okay, if there are foods that you don't feel trigger your gastritis or your problems and you're able to add them back in, add them back in. Like, start going through one at a time and finding some foods, because and meanwhile too, she's struggling with nutritional deficiencies and she's been getting vitamin B12 shots, and she's seriously thinking about getting iron infusions because she's deficient. And I'm like, oh my God, but you're eating 10 foods. Like, how did this nutritionist, again, I'm sure well-meaning, but how did this nutritionist think that it's cool that she has you eating a diet of 10 foods and getting B12 shots and thinking about iron infusions? How did this come to be when, like, I'm sorry, even if you are feeding the SIBO, and even if that slows down your SIBO progress a little bit, for that person, you're better off introducing a bunch of new foods so that you can get freaking nutrients into your body, and then tackle the SIBO after the fact. Like, don't even sweat it at that point. But I wanted to tear my hair out and I wanted to give her a hug. So I was like, how did you get to this point? Thank God you found me. Oh my God. Like, you poor human.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the overuse of antimicrobials and overuse of restricted diets just kills me, because it's going to wipe out diversity. And kind of like an executive summary for the middle of the episode here is that diversity in the colon, aka the large bowel, has been shown to protect you from damn near every disease on planet Earth. Like, I guarantee you, if you type in the name of a disease and you type in microbiota diversity on PubMed, you will find something. I'm talking like asthma, eczema, autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, like you name it, you can find it. But what's starting to come around finally is that more and more studies are showing that people with SIBO, which again, we've always thought, not we, but we, like, there's been this thought of like, oh, SIBO, overgrowth, kill and starve in the small bowel. But now we're realizing with like Dr. Pimentel's latest study that came out in late 2020, and then all the way back to that one study we've mentioned from 2012, people with SIBO, like confirmed diagnosis of SIBO, have lower diversity in the small bowel. So it's not just the colon, it's the small intestine too. You need diversity in that microbiota. And that study from 2012, which we can nerd over again, showed that it was the lack of diversity that correlated with symptoms in patients with SIBO. The degree of overgrowth or the diagnosis of overgrowth did not correspond with their symptom presentation. It was the lack of diversity that correlated well with symptoms. So I think that we've been chasing the wrong horse all along.
Yeah.
And give it another, like 30 years. But I think that the SIBO powers that be will finally come around and see, oh, heck, maybe we need to label it differently. Maybe it needs to be small intestinal microbial dysbiosis.
Right.
SIBD. That's okay.
Doesn't roll off the tongue as nicely, but
yes, it does, Amy. Run me on this. Okay. We are going to post on our social media accounts #SIBD, and it's going to be a new thing. So yes. SIBD is the new diagnosis. SIBD. Small intestinal actually SIMD. Small intestinal microbial dysbiosis would be more accurate. And then we're encompassing fungal, bacterial, archaea, the whole kit and caboodle. So the new diagnosis, all of you all who have been diagnosed with SIBO, now when you're talking to people at parties like you do, and you're telling them about SIBO, you need to tell them now that you have SIMD.
Yes.
Yeah, SIMD.
Yes. 100%.
Small intestinal microbial dysbiosis rather than overgrowth. Because overgrowth, you get that knee-jerky thing where it's like, oh, overgrowth infection. Yes. And you think that you have to use freaking guerrilla warfare tactics on the overgrowth, when in actuality, you probably just have mad small intestinal dysbiosis and sucky motility. And I say that with love.
Right. And I think, too, like, the sad thing for me that I find, like, people are so ingrained with that mindset that it can make them not necessarily listen to what's working with their body. Like, I've seen people, do round after round of herbals, and none of the rounds have helped. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It'd be one thing if that person, they did a round of herbals and it really, really helped. Yeah. And they kind of stay that route. But I find a lot of people are doing like rifaximin or herbals back to back to back and no like benefit at all. Yeah. And
because
again,
they've been told that it should help.
Right. So they're like, oh, I just like haven't found the right combination, or I haven't. And I'm just like, no, maybe this like isn't the right approach at all for you. And you have to kind of listen into what's working. But even changing mindset from that point, sometimes like, well, I have this overgrowth, like I'm just not clearing it. I'm not clearing it enough. And I'm just like, no, maybe like what we're saying, there's a diversity issue or a motility or kind of things are breaking down that are preventing you from moving things through your gut properly. Like, I just think it's such a shame. And we're going to have to be the new pioneers for our, what is it? SIBD.
Okay. That's it. We're gonna get the hang of it. We're gonna talk about SIBD on future podcast episodes, and people are gonna be very perplexed. Yes. I'm gonna try to not say SIBO ever again. I'm gonna try to call it SIBD for the rest of my life. It's gonna be great. People will be like, "What is she talking about?"
I know. That'll be great, though.
It'll be glorious.
I love that. I think Lucy Mailing has some good articles about small intestinal microbiota dysbiosis, that sort of stuff. If anyone's kind of interested, you can check out some of her articles on that.
Lucy, if you're listening, we would love to have you on the podcast. We need to email her. Like we keep talking about it and we just keep forgetting to, she's going to think that we're stalkers because we keep saying like, I keep saying like every other episode, like Lucy Mailing, if you're listening, but mark my words, we're going to contact her eventually. Yes, we have an upcoming guest in, what is it? 2 weeks, I think? Yes. Or a week.
Yes.
Yeah.
A psychologist, the 24th.
Super pumped. Well, we're recording it on the 24th, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so then for sure.
We're a couple weeks ahead on recording, but yeah, I'm super pumped about that conversation as a side note. So everybody get pumped.
Yeah, it'll be great. Yeah.
But anyway, going back though, so large intestine microbiota diversity, well researched. Like we've researched the crap out of that. And we know that it protects you against everything. Anything bad or inflammatory or a disease, you name it, you're good. If you have a diverse gut, relatively speaking. With small intestine microbial diversity, the only research articles that I've really looked at it in is SIBO. I don't know if they've researched small intestinal microbial diversity specifically with other conditions other than like maybe IBS and SIBO.
Yeah.
But I think it's because of that like overgrowth kind of thought process. But let's talk about now how to develop a diverse, happy, rich ecosystem. And again, like you can kind of see some of this already, dear listeners. So if antibiotics and antimicrobials or their overuse diminishes your diversity, then one strategy would be to avoid using those things unless you really, really need to. And you've got to be your own advocate. So if you're stuck in like the never-ending SIBO, I've got to kill it all loop, then you need to kind of zoom out and see if you can take a different direction. But even like, this drives me up the wall too, because I'm a child of the 1980s, and I had all the antibiotics on earth.
Right,
like,
me too.
Truckloads. And it was like ear infection after ear infection, strep throat, you name it, I had antibiotics. And looking back now, I'm like, oh, but it was the 80s, right? Like, oh, it's understandable. They didn't know any better. I think they did, but only a little bit. But now it astonishes me. In this day and age, still, the willy-nilly prescribing of antimicrobials is just astonishing. Again, both in the conventional space and the functional space. Functional medicine doctors are just happy as pigs in shit to diagnose you with SIBO and then give you round after round after round after round after round of berberine or biocidin or, oregano, you name it. They're totally fine doing tons of antimicrobials. But then I also look and I'm like, conventional medicine, you have learned nothing from decades past and children like me, because then just like a couple years ago, I don't know if I told you this, a few years ago when my daughter went to preschool for the first time, I was arrogant and naive and silly. When we started preschool with her, everybody was like, oh, wait until those germs. And I was like, I'm good. I take elderberry. I take vitamin D. I'm going to be fine. No. Preschool germs are next level. And it took us like a good couple of months to acclimate to the preschool germs, because I swear to God, Mike and my mom and I were sick for like months, on and off, on and off. And thank God our immune systems eventually got the swing of it. But there was a period of time where all of us had a cough for some reason. And it wasn't really going away. And I'm stubborn. I won't take things unless I really, really have to. I have to be like dying. And my mom's an overprotective mom. I'm an only child. And my mom laid a guilt trip on me and basically told me, you need to go get checked out because you have a daughter that you need to live for. And what will happen to her if you die? Like, pretty much she's painting the picture that I could die from this. And I'm like, okay. So I went into urgent care and I told the nurse practitioner the following. Paraphrasing, because it was like 3 years ago, but still. I basically told this nurse practitioner when she came in, I was like, okay, look. So I'm here because I have this cough that won't go away. And I'm a little bit thinking about things like pneumonia and maybe I need to get it checked out. I'm here for your medical opinion. And I want you to listen to my lungs and tell me if you really think I need antibiotics, I will take them. But I just want you to know that I have celiac disease. I have a history of irritable bowel syndrome. I've had a lot of antibiotics in my lifetime. I don't want to take antibiotics. I'm just going to take them if you tell me they're medically necessary. But like, I want you to know that I'm not seeking antibiotics. I basically said that with some different wording because it was 3 years ago. And she did the shittiest physical exam in my entire life. She listened to my lungs one side or one location on each lung 2 times. For those of you who don't know, in school, when we were taught to do a physical exam, we were taught that you're supposed to listen to each lung in 7 different locations. So you're supposed to start up at the top and listen to 7 different locations on the left, and then 7 different locations on the right. She listened to 2 out of the 14 that she should have listened to, first of all. Did not do a chest x-ray, didn't do anything. She listened to my lungs in 2 places and goes, okay, yeah, so here's the antibiotic, here you go. And then the thing that killed me, I just being yeast paranoid and stuff, I was like, oh, and by the way, I have a history of candida stuff. So can you, if you're going to write me a prescription for antibiotics, can you also write me a 1-day script for diflucan? You would have thought I asked her for 8-ball crack cocaine. Then she's very concerned. And then she's like, well, I'm concerned because of liver enzymes. And, it's not something that you should just take. And meanwhile, she gives me a prescription for 10 days of doxycycline and doesn't give a shit about that. And she's all too happy to give me that prescription. But 1 day of diflucan or fluconazole, and she's like, are you sure? It could raise your liver enzymes. And I had to be like, lady, I've never had elevated liver enzymes in my life, and I run a big blood work panel on myself every single year. I'm going to be fine. But it cracked me up. But then there's a point to this story. Bear with us, dear listeners. So I go home and I'm like, all right, damn, I guess I need this. So I took a dose of doxycycline and went to bed. Cut to the next day. And I had this feeling, because I was like, oh, I really hate that I'm taking antibiotics. And I still felt like I didn't need them. And then I had this epiphany, dumbly, where I go, wait, I'm a doctor. I've listened to lungs before and I have a stethoscope. I'm going to listen to my own lungs. And I listened to my lungs. They sounded fine to me. And then I thought, well, hell, I have YouTube. So I went to YouTube and I typed in bronchitis, viral bronchitis cough. And don't you know, it was the exact same cough that I had for a month. I'm like, okay. And then I listened to pneumonia cough. Nothing like what I sounded like. I'm like, okay. And then I happened to look, because she gave me a packet of stuff when I left, a bunch of handouts and stuff on colored paper. And I looked, and underneath the prescription that I had filled, and underneath one more sheet of paper, there was a handout all about viral bronchitis. And the first sentence was, because viral bronchitis is caused by a virus, antibiotics are not indicated because it's a freaking virus. And and it was basically saying viral bronchitis can stick around for a while. It could linger for 2 or 3 months. You just have to give it enough time. But you don't need an antibiotic because you have viral bronchitis. And I was just like, ah!
Oh my gosh.
I specifically told her I did not want antibiotics. WTF? Okay, in the 80s, I will be transparent. My mom is, again, a bit overprotective. She loves me. I'm an only child. But I could picture my mom in the 80s or 90s marching me into the pediatrician office and being the parent who's like, I will not leave here until you fix my baby and give us a drug. I could picture my mom being that mom. I don't know if she was, but I could picture it. So in the 80s and 90s, when people, and even today, if a parent is coming in and demanding that you fix their kid or whatever, or they get their money's worth out of the appointment or whatever, I can see how some clinicians are going to cave to that and be like, oh, okay, here's an antibiotic. But I told her I didn't want an antibiotic, and she still gave me an antibiotic. So the moral of the story is, be your own advocate, try to have a good dialogue with your providers, and then double check all the handouts and shit that they give you, because apparently there are people out there in this day and age who will diagnose you with viral bronchitis and then give you doxycycline anyway and send you on your merry way, to think that you must have pneumonia and you're going to die if you don't take the doxy. So that is that shtick. You talk.
It's
I felt like I
amazing.
just talked for a long time. You say words now. I'm like exhausted.
No, you settle down over there. I'm gonna let you take a breather. No, I think that it is amazing the level of filling antibiotic prescriptions like candy, even when they're not indicated. I think a lot of times like things like ear infections, sinus infections too can be fungal as well. I know the sinus ones. And so like a lot of times people that have chronic sinusitis are getting antibiotics. It's just making the problem worse if it's a fungal situation. So it's complicated, and I'm not anti-antibiotics. They have a time and place, but it's like it is a little ridiculous. So I think you're right. Yeah. Have some due diligence when you're going in for if you're sick or struggling with something. There is a time and a place, and I'd make sure that you're having an open dialogue with your practitioner. Mm-hmm. Like what you're saying. Hopefully they're better than the practitioner that you dealt with.
Kills me.
Right.
And if you are the nurse practitioner who I saw 3 years ago in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I hope you learned the lesson from this. You never know.
I think she did. Listening. I think she's definitely listening to this.
She's definitely
because she cares so much about diversity. It sounds like
absolutely. This is right up her alley.
Right.
Oh, gosh.
But yeah, I think the antibiotics are huge, trying to limit that from a diversity standpoint. I think we've talked a lot about the diet side of things. And maybe we talk a little bit about, like, if you're coming from a place of, like, a restrictive diet, what kind of strategies to help to gradually increase diversity?
Yeah, I think that's a worthy thing. Also, I'll throw out there, I read a study not that long ago. I forgot, I was putting it in a PowerPoint. And apparently there are between 200,000 and 300,000 edible plant species on planet Earth. And about 75% of our food comes from, I think, 12 plants and 5 animals.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So even, it's funny because I have this handout that I give patients. And I'll do similar to the last time. I'll put it on my website. So I'll make the URL like infinityholistichealth.com/diversity. So you could download that if you want it. But I have this handout where like people basically circle stuff on a tracker. And, if you eat an apple, you circle apple. If you circle carrots, et cetera. And then at the end of the week, you tally up your points. And it gives you a nice like objective way to track your diversity. Instead of you being the person who's like, I think I eat healthy, or I think I eat diverse. It's like, okay,
right.
Write it down, track it, see what happens. And on that even, I mean, I'm telling people you want to get like 30 or 40 points in a week, but it's like, oh, maybe we need to be reaching way higher. Like you were saying with the FMT, they have those donors eating 100 different foods a week. Or no,
that was a month. Yeah.
But still,
and they said, and the wild thing about that was in an interview that he was saying, and he said when he would challenge the donors to do that, like he could see in the stool quality, like just looking at it, that it was different. Like not even looking at the microbiome, but like he could tell in the quality and like the size, like which is funny, but he could like tell just when he had them do this challenge that their stool, right, the girth and the quality was a little bit different. But yeah, I think, from someone coming from a restrictive mindset and having low diversity, I usually tell people to, as you're building diversity up, start slow. I don't think it has to be like you're ripping a Band-Aid off and trying a whole bunch at once. Like, try to maybe sprinkle in some new things, take it one step at a time. Typically, I'll also tell people that it's kind of normal to have some like transitional changes, and sometimes they could be labeled symptoms, but like having a little bit of gas, like extra gas, or even having like some slight bloating if you're trying a food you haven't tried in 2 years or whatever it is, like to me is pretty normal. So I typically will tell my clients like having a headspace, like being in the headspace to try some things and know like, oh, like having a little bit of symptoms is okay, or like transitional response to some foods is totally normal. And then I also think, it's okay if something doesn't go well either. Like if you're trying some foods, like just don't eat the food again and kind of leave it out for now. So there's a level of experimentation that goes into building diversity up when you're coming from a restrictive mindset and a restrictive background. But I think from my standpoint, it's really about taking it slow, getting in a good mindset space or a good headspace before doing it. I think so key. But as much kind of diversity that you can get in, even from the foods that you tolerate well, like sometimes even starting there, like if even before adding things in that you haven't had in a while, just thinking about your meals, like could you make them more diverse with foods that you tolerate, and then kind of building out from there. But it can be a little tricky, I think, coming from that restrictive mindset to jump to that, like the 30 to 40 foods, which I think like what you said though too, is that enough? It's hard to totally know. I think that's a great starting point for sure.
Yeah. And I tell people too, like, start with the 30 or 40 that I write on that handout. And then if you could try to, if you fill one of these out every week, for example, which sometimes I have patients do for a couple weeks, you can then like compare the handouts and see, are these pretty much identical? Like, I got 30 points each week, but they came from the same exact 30 foods.
Right.
So it's like you could take it above and beyond and really play with it a lot. But I think that starting slow and knowing that a little bit of change is to be expected. One of the smartest things I ever heard, I thought, was when I did my preceptorship at the end of my schooling. A chiropractor that I worked with told a patient once, or in a talk, I think, she said, the body oftentimes will register change, but it doesn't always register good versus bad change right away. So and she was talking about it because she was a chiropractor. So she was talking about like when you get a new pillow or a new bed, and she was like, you might be a bit sore, or you might like need more adjustments for a week or two because your body is just realizing that there's a change. It doesn't really know if it's good or bad yet. So like if you have a bit of discomfort or neck tightness or back pain the first week or 2 or 3 of having a new bed or a new pillow, like don't just immediately assume that it's not a good bed. Give your body at least a couple of weeks or a month to really like acclimate to that. And then you can pass judgment on whether or not it's a good or bad change. But I thought that was really smart and really like broadly applicable, but really profound. Because I think similarly, like your microbiome is going to register change, not necessarily if it's good or bad, but like if you have, to try to put like a number on it, even though it doesn't make sense. If you think about like your absolute worst SIBO bloating as being 100%, whatever that might be. If you experience like 10, 20, maybe even 30% of that bloating because you just added in a new FODMAP, but otherwise you feel okay and it's like transient, you can deal with it, that could be expected. It could be that your microbiome hasn't seen that food in a long time, months or years, and it's going to be a little bit shell-shocked to see like, holy crap, is that a bean? And it needs a minute to process that. So, but it's funny. I don't know if you ever get this perception, but sometimes in certain ways, I wish people were more in tune with their body. And then sometimes in certain ways, I wish people were less in tune with their body. Because like that, especially when it comes to this, and again, like bless their hearts, this comes from functional medicine because we're all about the elimination diet and being really vigilant when you add foods back in. And that's cool. But also some people, it turns into a little bit of like an anxiety trigger or a neuroses where it's like, okay, I added an avocado and now I wait and I observe. And like you sit there terrified of the avocado coursing through your body. Or it's like, you feel one little gas bubble and you're like, no, I'm going to be in awful shape. And it's like, not necessarily like you need to give it the space to do something before you pass judgment on it. But I think like diversifying the foods that you can do. So like if you are eating a low FODMAP diet, maybe just reference like a list of low FODMAP foods and make sure you're getting a lot of diversity from that low FODMAP food list first. And then also I would say, if you know that there are foods that you could tolerate, even if they are on your bad list, then I usually have people start with those. So like one of my IBS patients who we think has SIBO, but we haven't ever tested because I don't think she'll tolerate the sugar solution very well. But like she was told to do low FODMAP, but there's a couple of foods, like I remember broccoli and I think a couple other cruciferous veggies where she was like, I never had a problem with them. And I told the practitioner that at the time, like I never had a problem with broccoli, but they insisted she had to cut out broccoli. So we had the conversation of, okay, add broccoli back in. Like that's a really good starting point. And then, you know, if there are things that you were told to eliminate, again, like this woman I spoke with this week, who was told that she had to eliminate all the FODMAPs because she maybe has SIBO. Like, if there are certain foods that you know historically you've tolerated well and you don't have a history of having symptoms from, add those in first, and then you can work on the question marks. Like, if you're not sure about avocado, maybe that comes in a little bit later. But, you know, it's like, get the easy points when you can, and then you'll kind of build momentum off of that, because then you're going to build diversity. You're going to be less inflamed, your microbiome is going to be happier and healthier, and then it's going to put you in a spot where you're better able to tolerate the foods that are really trigger foods. You might find that if you tried to add, for example, like onion in your diet, right away, number one. Like if you went from low FODMAP and then one day you're like, I'm going to try to add onion in because Amy and Nikki told me to. Yeah. Like if that's your first food, but you've been eating 10 foods for like a year or whatever, you're probably not going to tolerate that onion super well, realistically. But if you build your diversity with the foods that you are able to tolerate, the foods that are on the okay list, the foods that you have history with that you just know that you're going to be able to do fine with, or if you start adding in like other strategies like exercise into your regimen that will help foster diversity, if you can build momentum with those things, you'll have a more diverse, happy microbiota. You'll have a less leaky gut. You will be less inflamed. And then when you add in that same exact food, that same exact onion, you're going to be in a better position to tolerate that food. So choose kind of the sequence of your additions wisely, because the order that you go in might affect whether or not something is triggering for you when you do introduce it.
Right. I think you made some great points. I think I had written down, and you covered it, the kind of the self-aware, like the awareness and the hypervigilance that often comes with being restrictive. I think that goes along with the mindset of I can control symptoms based on food removal. And if you're in that mindset, that's something to definitely tackle a little bit before doing, or again, maybe you start slow with some of the things, building diversity within a low FODMAP context, and then build out from there. I also, one thing too, I would say a lot of times I'll try to tell people to pick foods, one, again, that they don't remember having a super negative reaction to, or that they kind of removed willy-nilly based off a list. But then the second thing is that you would kind of be excited to add back in too. Yes. Like I think, you know, the more that you'd be like, oh, this would be like so great if I could add it back in. I think that helps from a mindset standpoint. Huge. So I do try to encourage people to like think about like what food do you miss some food? Like, would you be excited to add that back in? I remember one client she was great. She was so funny to me. She had been to a practitioner, I think a nutritionist or something, I forget who exactly, who told her that regular white potatoes were bad, so she had to remove them, but sweet potatoes were okay. I don't know what diet context this was in, but she was like skeptical of it because she told me about it. She's like, I don't know why, like I could eat sweet potatoes but not regular potatoes. And she said the woman didn't necessarily articulate it super well, but was just like, no, white potatoes are bad. Sweet potatoes are good. And I was like, well, like, let's try white potatoes. They were her favorite food. Plain white potatoes. She didn't put anything on them. Just plain. Maybe like a little salt and pepper, but like no butter, no. This woman, like, because I told her she could eat sweet potatoes, like thought I was like the queen of all like because then
I mean, you
she
are the
just
queen, arguably,
well,
but
maybe
nonetheless.
but it's so funny because like I could have done nothing else but told her to eat potatoes, and she would have just like loved working with like thought I was the best because I gave her the potatoes again. But I think that there's all these weird food rules that sometimes they just don't make any sense. But for her, again, the white potatoes were so exciting to like add back in. Like she was so pumped. And she tolerated them just fine. And I think for you, I usually tell my clients to like think of like those foods again that you don't necessarily have a bad reaction to or hadn't in the past. And then also the ones that you're excited about.
Yes.
I'll usually have them maybe write out like a list of 5 to 10 to start with. But yeah, I think the level of excitement helps when it comes to reintro. But you did mention something really cool too that we can elaborate on is the exercise piece. The exercise piece being so big from a diversity standpoint. And I find, and again, it's another crux of the functional medicine space because I feel like they do sort of talk about things like movement and stress management and like circadian rhythm stuff, like some of the lifestyle pieces, but it's more like an afterthought because so much of the focus is on the diet side of things.
Yeah.
But I think exercise, again, there's research to support that movement and exercise can help build diversity within the gut. And again, it's something that is generally very health promotive. And so the movement piece is huge. And again, if you're not necessarily feeling like you're tolerating a ton of foods at this point and you're like slowly building things in, that can be an easy one that you can add in and build on and work on too as you're building up diversity from a diet standpoint. So I love that you brought up that point.
Yeah. And I will say, I think that this is something to be aware of just broadly. Clinicians and healthcare professionals usually end up teaching about and preaching the things that help them the most or the things that they are into the most. So as an example, I have not been an avid worker outer for a lot of years. I mean, like, I'm not in horrible shape. Like, I'll walk to work. I live about a mile away from my office, so I'll walk to work when the weather is nice. So I walk 2 miles that day. But I haven't, like, really gotten my sweat on consistently for more than, like, a month at a time in a number of years. But I was a rower in college. Like, I was in damn good shape in college.
Well, that's what I was gonna say. Maybe you just like went too hard in college and burned yourself out a little bit.
Well, I think it's a combination of I'm a naturally kind of lazy person. And it's a miracle that I was a rower because, honestly, I don't know how I woke up that early and I don't know how I exerted myself like that. And also, my coach in college was a pretty nasty guy. And he kind of made me fall out of love with the sport, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of years where I didn't want to think about rowing. I didn't want to think about anything that reminded me of Rudy because I was just kind of like over it. So there's probably like that mental PTSD piece of it too.
Yeah.
But I think a bigger part is I'm just lazy. And it was really easy to fall back into that. But the irony is that, do you know what my bachelor's degree is in?
Is it an exercise science or something like that?
It is. Lord. So I can tell you all of the physiology and all of like what happens with the mitochondria and the capillaries and the VO2 max and all that crap. I can tell you exactly why exercise is amazing for you. And yet I have not been an avid exerciser for, I mean, like 10 plus years. I'll be like on again, off again. It depends on the season of my life. But as such, I don't tend to talk about exercise a ton with my patients. I ask everybody on the intake forms if they exercise, and I ask what type. And then I ask, there's like a scale of 1 to 5, how willing you are to do certain things. And I ask how willing people are to exercise. And it's interesting, like most of my patients will say 5 out of 5 for change their diet, 5 out of 5 for taking herbs and supplements and pills.
Right.
And maybe like 3 or 4 or maybe 5 out of 5 for exercise. And it's really interesting. It's like, but exercise could be much cheaper. depending on what you do. Like, you could potentially exercise for free at home if you just dance along with a YouTube video or do a yoga video on YouTube. But it's funny, like, people, I'm noticing generally are not as willing to have that conversation. They want to come to me and get like the magical pill that'll cure them. And sometimes the magical pill is exercise. But I was just confessing to you, when I don't exercise, I get constipated. And I know I need to exercise, and that is my magic pill. But yeah, I think a lot of functional medicine practitioners don't talk about exercise, maybe because they're not avid exercisers, or maybe because they have gotten kickback from their patients who, it's like, if you spend a lot of your career making a recommendation and people don't follow that recommendation, you're going to stop making it eventually. Like, if you tell all your patients to go gluten-free and then only like 1% of them actually follows you up on that and goes gluten-free, eventually you're going to give up and stop wasting your breath.
Right.
So it's probably some combination of the two, or they might not know all of the benefits of exercise, but I feel like that's kind of an easy gimme.
Well, and I do think another part of the equation is that the diet restriction is so like energy sucking, and like we only have a certain allotment of energy and resources. So like if a client's coming to you and you are someone that advocates like low FODMAP or SIBO specific or biphasic, and it takes a lot of time and energy to plan your meals and stress around that, I feel like there's less energy and time to be invested in other areas.
Calories too, because if you're not eating a lot of calories, like, you're not going to have the energy to exercise hard.
100%. So yeah, I just wonder too if, the investment that's expected from a diet side of things is too intense that it prevents focus in other areas as well. I think that that's a big factor. And I think that the exercise standpoint too, like, it doesn't have to be anything intense either. Like, I think there is some value in doing like different movements, sometimes more low intensity, sometimes more high intensity. With gut stuff, you want to be a little careful with the high intensity stuff, especially if you're going through it. But I do think that, typically my exercise regime is like walking most days, and then I have 2 days a week that I do kind of more intense weight training. So I think sometimes too, like, exercise sounds really intense for people sometimes. Like, what does that look like? Like, there's almost a resistance because of how we typically picture exercise, like the like just CrossFit. Do it, like, the Nike people, like the Under Armour commercials, like, if you're not going 110%, then you're not going at all, that type of mentality. And I think you probably had that, and it was turning you off in the rowing space. And I think that's what turns off a lot of people from an exercise standpoint, because it's not like they're really focusing on something that they enjoy. It's like they're just doing it to just do it, the Nike.
Yeah, because they have to do it.
Right. So, I think trying to find something that you enjoy and maybe even like pairing, like if you do want to set like a walking goal, I think is a good one that pretty much everyone can do. Listen to a podcast, like do something you enjoy while you're on the walk as well can be helpful. But yeah, I think the exercise piece is cool. I like it a lot.
Even having a buddy, like I remember my mom got really diligent about walking quite a lot. Like she was walking all over the place. But a large part of it was, she started going to the gym and she got a treadmill and she would walk or jog on the treadmill. But for a long time there, it was so cute. She would peer pressure her friends into going with her. Like, she would go around to people's cubicles and be like, okay, time for a walk, come on. And people would be like, oh, but I was going to work at my desk and eat lunch at my desk today. And she's like, nope, come on, get off your ass, come on. And she would like peer pressure people. It was so precious. And then her best friend that worked in the same office with her, she would bribe her friend Martha with one of those like C's candies.
Oh my
truffle
gosh.
Things. She always had a stash of those truffles because Martha sometimes she would go willingly and sometimes she would not. And my mom would have to bribe her with 1C's candy. And she was like, okay. And then she would
like
go.
Pavlov's dogs or
kind
something.
of.
Like,
and it was just so precious. But yeah, like my mom was like the ringleader for a lot of years. And she would have this like gang of women who would go walk around when she worked in Boston. It was so cute. And they all had pedometers. They all compared their numbers. Like at the end of the day, they would text each other their numbers. But like even just like the community piece of it, I think that's a piece of why I'm not as diligent as working out.
yeah, for sure.
When I was a rower, I had a team of 60 girls and my coaches who were depending on me. They couldn't go out on the water without me. Right? Like for those of you who don't know the sport of rowing, you cannot put an 8-person boat on the water with 7 people. Like you just don't do that.
Yeah.
So they were depending on me. And also I had the social element of like, I could talk to them, you know, while we were getting the boat ready or in between sets or in between whatever. And like, we had the camaraderie and like the group energy. And like, I think that I actually really crave that part of it. So I'm hoping the world goes back to normal soon. Cause like, I think I'm a person who needs like a membership at a yoga studio or like a membership at a jazzercise place or somewhere where I could go and like be with a group of people consistently and like feed off of that energy and know that people are like waiting for me. Because if it's just me doing it for the sake of me, I'll come up with excuses or I'll be like, I'm too cold, I'm too tired, I don't wanna. So I think that is a piece of it too.
That's totally true. I mean, unfortunately, I know my gym's back open. I'm probably going to get back there relatively soon, but my gym that I've gone to here has been great. Like I see the same people each week. Like there's some kind of funny personalities in the group too. Like, so it's just really, it's a fun environment to go to. And plus I work from home. So it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it's the one, especially before Armand was working here too, my husband. It was like the interaction I had that was face to face with someone other than my husband through the week, where I'd go twice a week to the gym.
Exactly.
So I think you're right. The more you can make it fun, community based, connective, probably the better you're going to be able to hang with it and make it consistent. And
you might get overlap and benefit for your vagus nerve for that
matter
too. So, twofer.
For sure.
Can I tell you, I feel like we've covered most of the things now, but can I tell you about my gym boyfriend?
Yes.
Okay. So my bachelor's is in exercise science. And when I was in grad school, I had a couple of jobs. I was a tutor for like anatomy and biochem and physiology. And when I wasn't tutoring, I actually also got a job at a local gym as a personal trainer. And it was like, I loved it, not as much as what I love now and do now, but like I pretty much got all of the complicated people because they knew I was in chiropractic school and they knew I like knew anatomy and stuff. So if there was anybody with like an injury or anybody who was like old or frail or had stuff going on, like anybody who wasn't like a bro, they would basically send to me. And I loved it because I had this gaggle of like old folks and like injured folks and people recovering from stuff. And I got to do like a blend of personal training and like PT with them. And so I worked at this gym. I worked at an LA Fitness for about a year and a half, I would say, overall. And there was this old man who was my boyfriend. And I say that because I think that he was convinced of that. He was about 1,000 years old, and he was very tiny and like shriveled up like a raisin. And he every day, his name was Mac, and every day he would be pedaling at people who are not on YouTube right now. You're going to miss out on this, but this was the speed that the pedals would go on the recumbent bike. Are you ready?
Oh my gosh.
Just so slow. But Mac was there every day, and he was like this 1,000-year-old womanizer. He flirted shamelessly with all the girls, and like if it was anybody else, like an able-bodied man, I would think he was creepy, but because he was like 1,000 years old, at some point old men get a pass for this.
Yeah.
But he was so precious, and we would chit-chat. And I say that he was my boyfriend because I went to school in Southern California. He had an avocado tree, and he brought me avocados on more than one occasion. Oh my gosh. Which was like, oh my God, the way to my heart is food and like weird references to Japanese anime or cats.
Yes.
Like, so pretty much he nailed it with avocados. And then I had, my now husband and I were not engaged, but he had given me a promise ring that I wore on my ring finger. And Max saw that and commented one day and said something about, oh, if you weren't engaged, I would snatch you up in a heartbeat or something like that. Gosh. And I was just like, okay, sure you would.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, he literally, and I called Mike and I was like, you've got competition.
Oh
and I like played around with that. But yeah, Mac was about 1 million years old. He did pass away when I was still working at LA Fitness. So we had like a little plaque, like a picture of him on the desk for a while because we all missed him. But he was just so precious and
I love that.
Such a womanizer. But yeah, he was my knight in shining armor that brought me avocados and cycled at 0.001 miles an hour on the recumbent bike. But it's like, they say like, oh, going to the gym is good for old folks because you like get that social connection and it helps prevent dementia. And I swear, I don't care if you're in your teenage years through, 1,000 years old like Mac, like everybody benefits from social interaction. Even if you deem yourself an introvert or not a people person, like everybody craves contact with other animals or other humans. So making that part of like how you go about your exercise routine can be really helpful. And maybe you too will get a boyfriend who gives you avocados and makes comments about if you weren't taken, I'd snatch you up in a heartbeat. So maybe you'll meet your Mac.
If that isn't something to shoot for, I don't know what is.
Hashtag goals.
Yes. And I another cute thing that can build diversity in your microbiome is getting a pooch.
Yes.
Getting a pooch. I mean, they're going and rolling around in the dirt. I think getting exposed to nature in general can help with diversity, but getting a pooch when they can do the rolling around in nature for you and then come and
bring it in.
Expose you to all the things. I know we were talking about how my dog keeps eating deer poop earlier before we jumped on the call.
And then he probably licks your fingers, licks your face.
Right. Getting all the diversity.
All of it. Look, you didn't need to go get FMT. You wasted all that money going to the Bahamas, and you could have just let Chip French you.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, I think, pooches help in a lot of different ways. I think it's been an interesting experience getting a dog because I never had a dog. And I didn't even know I was a dog person until Chip. So there's been a lot of change. But I think it helps with the vagus nerve again, like connection. You get that oxytocin when they're like cuddled with you. So getting a pooch is another potential option.
I definitely think so. And I know I'll paint this picture for you too. So I was sharing before we got on the call that my last two dogs, Bonnie and Clyde, would not only eat poop, but they would eat each other's poop regularly. And like we tried to scare them away, but yeah, they would dine on each other's poo on the regular. And when we first moved to North Carolina, we lived with my parents for a while because we were getting to know the area and we were starting my practice. And my mom's dog, Coco, the chocolate lab, and she's one of those dogs that no matter what time of day it is, no matter what, she will act like she's starving. Like she would always eat. Even if she just ate, she would eat another meal happily. And she looks like she's always begging for food. Well, Coco saw Bonnie and Clyde eating each other's poo, and I think she was like, wait, I could do that? And then she started eating poo. So my mom was quite perturbed when she realized that Coco was now eating poo. Because she was like, she never did that before. And I was like, I don't know. She learned a new trick. But then what's great is Okay, so my Uncle Paul, I make fun of my Uncle Paul all the time, and I've told him this, and he's such a sweetheart. He doesn't mind. So I talk about my Uncle Paul with my patients all the time because when I give my patients that diversity handout, which again, I'll link it for you guys. So infinityholistichealth.com/diversity if you want to download that. But if my uncle ever did the diversity game where he circled stuff on the paper, he would only ever get 1 point because the only fruit or vegetable the man ever eats is carrots. That is it. He will not touch anything green. He basically eats pizza and pasta and sandwiches. The only fruit or vegetable that he will eat is carrots. So like every holiday when he comes over, like we have to cook a carrot dish, like, you know, roasted carrots or something. And then, okay, there's 2 stories in this. So then the one year for Thanksgiving, we're like, well, we have to make carrots for Uncle Paul. Otherwise, he won't eat vegetable for Thanksgiving. So I got smart and I was like, I'm going to trick him. And I peeled a bunch of parsnips and carrots and I was chopping them up all nice on the diagonal, made it fancy. And I was telling Uncle Paul, I was like, hey, Uncle Paul, I'm peeling carrots and white carrots for you for Thanksgiving, for your veggies. Yep. And I thought, hey, I'm going to get another veggie in the man. My Uncle Timmy, I love him so much, but my Uncle Timmy from the other side of the room goes, aren't those parsnips? Those look like parsnips. Are those parsnips? I think they're parsnips.
Oh,
I'm like, shut
up.
He
blew it.
He blew it. And Uncle Paul just laughed. And to his credit, every Thanksgiving and every Christmas, he will eat the carrots and white carrots because now it's a family joke. But other than that, my Uncle Paul would only get 1 point on the diversity tracker, so he probably has a super not diverse microbiome. But on the plus side, when he comes over to my parents' house, my parents' 2 dogs love him so much. Like, that is their boyfriend. They share him. It's like an open marriage of sorts, I suppose.
Yes.
Because both of the girls, the dogs, love him so much, and both of them, like, he gets there, they go bananas, their tails are wagging, they're going crazy, and he immediately, like, assumes the position, lays down on his back, and then they smother his face with kisses, and we all are like, oh, because we've seen, like, dog tongue in the mouth, in the nose, in the eyeballs. We're just like, oh. And Coco eats poo. I have seen Sasha eat some very suspicious things. And my parents have like a pond like a little miniature pond in the front of their house with like a waterfall feature. And we've seen both of the dogs drink out of that pond. And God knows what else they're eating. And they're like fully making out my uncle. And we're all like, ooh, oh gosh. Why? But maybe it's good because he doesn't get diversity from his food. So maybe the dogs are actually giving him kind of like an FMT situation where he's getting some microbes. So maybe they're actually saving his diversity and we shouldn't cringe and be grossed out by that.
I think that's a great thought. Puppy kisses equal diversity.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Especially when it's to the degree that Uncle Paul experiences it. Oh, Uncle Paul. Well, yeah, so your official prescriptions today, folks, are get a dog, get 2, get 3. I endorse all the dogs. Exercise, if you don't already. If you already exercise, cool, keep doing it. And then try to increase your dietary diversity however you can. And try to stay away from antimicrobials and antibiotics to whatever degree you can. But just know that diversity is super, super important, whether we're talking about diversity in the colon or the small bowel or the stomach or anywhere else. It is probably super ultra important. And I think that's all I've got. Amy, do you have any closing remarks for us?
The only thing I was going to add, and we'll talk about it, I think, next time, is circadian rhythms and sleep and those sorts of things that could affect the diversity as well.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have our follow up. I guess will be cliffhanger. Da da da. We're having a cliffhanger on that. So we'll talk about that. I think next time.
Awesome. I look forward to that. That's going to be a juicy one too. Well, guys, it was an absolute pleasure as always. You know the drill. If you are on YouTube, go ahead and click like, subscribe, click the little bell thingamabob, leave us a comment. We are accumulating comments and email questions, and we're going to do a Q&A episode eventually in the future. So go ahead and pop your Qs in the comment section down below on YouTube, or feel free to email us. And if you are on some sort of like podcasting app or whatever, feel free to rate us 5 stars, etc. Amy, our Instagram handle is
ibs.freedom.podcast.
Perfect. And hold on, I have to look at my email account. And our email address is ibsfreedompod@gmail.com. I had to confirm that it's pod and not podcast. So yeah, drop us a line, give us a ring-a-ling, except don't, because you don't have our numbers. But comment, email, say hi on Instagram. We will try to A, your cues in a future episode. But next episode is all about circadian rhythms and the gut, and it's going to be so good and so juicy, and I'm really pumped about that. So we will see you next time here on the IBS Freedom Podcast.